You are not supposed to exist. Half your DNA comes from a continent that your ancestors had never set foot on, and the other half comes from an island chain that had no business reaching you across 4,000 miles of the deadliest, most lonely ocean on Earth. Yet here you are. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why your very existence is the single greatest migration anomaly in human history, a living, breathing, genetic paradox that still has no complete explanation, and the final reason why will haunt you long after this video ends. For the vast majority of people on Earth, population genetics can now offer a tapestry of origins, a mix of steppe pastoralists, Anatolian farmers, West African foragers, a story that, however tangled, still follows a geographical logic, a walkable path across continents. But for approximately 30 million people today, their very blood carries a biological paradox, so extreme, so mathematically perfect, that it defies the laws of human migration. I'm talking about the presence of a specific mitochondrial lineage, a haplogroup known as B4A1A1, the Polynesian Motif precursor. If your maternal line carries this marker and you trace your family back to the massive island of Madagascar off the coast of Africa, your ancestors did not walk. They did not follow a coastline. They crossed 4,000 miles of the stormiest, most unforgiving open ocean on the planet, in vessels lashed together with plant fiber, navigating by the dead reckoning of stars and the flight path of birds. What you are about to hear is the definitive scientific recounting of a mystery that has haunted anthropology for centuries. The revelation that the Malagasy people are precisely half Asian and half African, an impossibility made flesh through a voyage we still, in many ways, fail to understand. For decades, the standard narrative of African history, the one taught in textbooks, the one whispered by colonial historians, was a story of strict continental segregation. The story went that sub-Saharan Africa was a world of terrestrial empires, of Bantu ironworkers spreading south and east across the savannas, isolated from the maritime revolutions of the Indian Ocean by the sheer hostility of the Mozambican Channel and the vast emptiness of the sea. We were told that the big island, Madagascar, lying just 400 kilometers off the African coast, was a natural extension of this Bantu expansion, a simple stepping stone populated by African fishermen who hugged the coastline. But there was a ghost in that record, a terrifying anomaly that European explorers kept bumping into with increasing confusion. When the Portuguese sea captain Diogo Dias first sighted Madagascar in the year 1500, he wasn't sailing into an African cultural sphere. He was sailing into an Asian one. And the first thing that tipped him off wasn't the language. It was the rice. The accepted narrative of African ethnogenesis is a powerful and elegant one, grounded in the Bantu expansion, one of the greatest demographic movements in human prehistory. It's a story that begins roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago in the highlands of present-day Cameroon and Nigeria. This was the crucible of the Niger-Congo language family, and the Bantu-speaking peoples, armed with iron-smelting technology and a robust agricultural package of yams and oil palms, began a slow, inexorable drift. They didn't just migrate, they pulsed. Over millennia, they followed the Congo Basin's rivers, skirted the Great Lakes, and ultimately colonized the entire eastern flank of the continent, reaching what is now Mozambique and South Africa. They absorbed the scattered groups of Khoisan hunter-gatherers and Central African pygmy forest dwellers they encountered along the way. Genetically, this history is beautifully legible. The Y chromosome of a modern East African Bantu man is almost always stamped with the lineage E1B1A. It's a mark that tracks that journey from the west to the east with absolute fidelity. So, as Western science built its models in the 20th century, it looked at a map and applied Occam's razor. Madagascar sits 250 miles off the coast of Mozambique. The easiest explanation, the only explanation that made sense for a mainland-focused narrative, was that Bantu agriculturalists simply crossed the channel in dugout canoes 500 or 1,000 years ago. But standing in the highland rice terraces of the Malagasy interior, surrounded by a landscape that looks uncannily like Borneo or Bali, an observer felt a profound dissonance. The people didn't look entirely African. Their skin tones ranged from deep ebony to copper bronze. Their eyes held an epicanthic fold. The music, with its gongs and xylophones, echoed the gamelan traditions of Southeast Asia. The accepted story was a fragile bubble, and it was waiting for a needle of data to pop it. That needle arrived in the mid-2000s, when a team of geneticists decided to stop looking at faces and start reading the raw, unforgiving code inside the cells. The anomaly that shattered the terrestrial model wasn't found in a dusty archaeological trench, but in a centrifuge in a lab at the University of Cambridge. In 2005, a pivotal study led by Matthew Hurls, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, took a scalpel to the paternal and maternal lineages of the Malagasy people. What they found biologically shouldn't exist. The genome wasn't a gradient. It wasn't a majority African blend with a tiny, distant splash of foreign spice. The genome was a brutal, clean, nearly 50-50 split. If you look at the Y chromosome, passed solely from father to son, you see two distinct rivers of ancestry. On one side, the African male lineage is unmistakable. The E1B1A Y DNA, the classic Bantu signature. But on the other side, from roughly the same proportion of men, the signal points to a lineage that had absolutely no business being in Africa at all. The Y haplogroups O1A and O2A. These are the calling cards of the Austronesian expansion, a genetic lineage born in the islands of Southeast Asia, a lineage that sailed to Taiwan, the Philippines, and deep into the Pacific. But the most destabilizing revelation came from the mitochondrial DNA, the tiny batteries of our cells inherited only from our mothers. The Hurls team found that the maternal line was dramatically skewed. The Asian mothers were overwhelmingly represented by mtDNA haplogroup B4A1A1, the very same Polynesian motif precursor I mentioned at the start. Meanwhile, the African mothers carried the L0, L1, L2, and L3 subclades so typical of the Bantu world. This genetic asymmetry was the Rosetta Stone of the mystery. It suggested a very specific and frankly unsettling demographic scenario. A boat, or a fleet, didn't just arrive as a mixed, equal society of men and women from Asia. The data screamed of a founding pulse where Asian men, carrying the O1A and O2A Y chromosomes, and Asian women, carrying the B4A1A1 mtDNA, arrived on the island. Then, a second wave of Bantu men, carrying E1B1A, and Bantu women, carrying the L lineages, joined the gene pool. But the fact that the Asian signal survived so purely, bumping right up against the African one, meant this all happened in a compressed, explosive window of time. It wasn't a slow trickle of lost fishing boats piling up over 10,000 years. It was a targeted, deliberate collision of two worlds in the first millennium CE. To understand the sheer audacity of that collision, we have to dive deeper into the genomic machinery, to trace not just the signal but the timing. A landmark study that shattered previous estimates came out around 2016 and 2017 in the journal Nature Communications, led by Denis Pierron, using genome-wide SNP data, effectively looking at hundreds of thousands of variable points across the entire genetic code. The team could build a molecular clock. Genes mutate at a relatively steady rate over generations. By measuring the length of shared chromosome segments between the Malagasy and reference populations from Africa and Borneo, they could ask a simple question. When did these blocks of foreign DNA enter the island? The answer was a radically tight window. The admixture date estimates coalesced not 5,000 years ago, not 3,000 years ago, but sometime between 500 and 1,400 years ago. Do the math. That places the contact squarely in the late first millennium to early second millennium of our common era. This was not prehistory. This was the height of the Tang dynasty in China. The Byzantine Empire was still standing. The great cities of the Swahili coast were just starting to trade ivory and gold. And somehow, a fleet of outrigger canoes from Borneo crossed the entire Indian Ocean. But Pierron's team didn't just tell us. When? They told us. Who? By comparing the Asian genetic component to databases across the Pacific Rim, they found the highest degree of fidelity with a very specific group of people from the Barito River Valley of southern Borneo, the Ma'anyan and related Dayak groups. This was a smoking gun. The Malagasy do not just share a vague ASEAN-ness with Borneo. They share a specific linguistic and genetic dialect. All Malagasy dialects belong to the Western Malayo-Polynesian branch of the Austronesian family, and within that, the Barito subgroup. The language spoken in the highlands of Madagascar today is fundamentally a fossilized Bornean tongue, with no African linguistic substrate in its grammar or core vocabulary. Imagine a jar, half filled with African rice and half with Asian rice, but the label on the jar is written exclusively in Austronesian. This implies a profound cultural dominance. It tells us the Austronesian speakers didn't just wash ashore and get absorbed. They likely arrived first, settled the island, and established the linguistic and agricultural framework, the rice terraces, the musical styles, the funerary architecture, before the Bantu speakers arrived, possibly as a secondary migration or integrated via a later, intensified trade network. Yet, this raises a dark, unresolved tension in the data. The Y chromosome shows Bantu men contributed heavily. The mtDNA shows Bantu women contributed heavily. Where did all the Austronesian men and women go in the genetic equation to create the 50-50 mix? The admixture calculation suggests a scenario where a relatively small number of initial Asian founders, perhaps a few hundred or a few thousand people, made landfall. Later, a sustained influx of Bantu people, men and women, from East Africa swamped parts of the island. Through generations of intermarriage, the signals evened out to that uncanny split. But the language, the intangible cultural DNA, remained locked in its Bornean cage. We are looking not just at a migration, but at a layering of identities that leaves us with biological armor, forged in two separate hemispheres. Let's widen the lens from the double helix to the landscape, because the ground itself confesses the secret. You can falsify a document, you can alter a myth, but you cannot fake the stratigraphy of a hearth or the chemical signature of ancient crop starch. The archaeological evidence from Madagascar and the nearby Comoros archipelago is a time machine that confirms the genetic horror. The Austronesian presence was real, and it was early. By the 8th or 9th century CE, a date that aligns perfectly with the older edge of the genetic admixture estimates, we find the unmistakable footprint of Southeast Asian life. Archaeologists aren't digging up African pearl millet in the earliest layers, they're digging up Asian rice. Oryza sativa japonica. They're finding charred remains of breadfruit, of the great tubers and banana cultivars that had spread from New Guinea across the Pacific. But the most catastrophic piece of evidence wasn't a plant, it was the vehicle. The rock art of Borneo is still debated, but on the islands of the Comoros, just west of Madagascar, excavations have revealed the chemical traces of timber hulls built with a technology completely alien to the African coastline of the time. The lashed lug outrigger canoe. This wasn't a hollowed log. This was a complex composite vessel, with a stabilizing outrigger that allowed it to slice through immense swells without capsizing. A craft capable of carrying dozens of people, water stores, and live breeding stock across the planet's most violent ocean. As you picture this vessel, cast your mind now to a specific stretch of DNA you may carry, the Y chromosome 01A. If you are of Malagasy heritage and carry this marker, your direct paternal ancestor did not just sit on a beach trading. He was likely a master shipwright, a sailor who read longitude in the swell patterns long before John Harrison invented the marine chronometer. By the time the great Arab geographer Al-Idrisi was sketching maps of the world in the 12th century, the Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mogadishu, Mombasa, were buzzing with commerce, linking the African interior to the Indian Ocean rim. It's in this crucible of connectivity that the Bantu component likely accelerated. Genetic studies, refining the Piron data, resequenced the African DNA, and found it matches closest to modern Bantu groups like the Makua and Yao from northern Mozambique. This fits a grim but historically vital mechanism, the slave trade. As the Swahili Arab trade for ivory, gold, and human captives intensified along the coast, a massive outflow of African DNA, captured from the hinterland, washed eastward. But while geneticists can measure the Bantu infusion, the initial spark, the very first sail on the horizon, explodes our understanding of the human capacity for mystery. And that brings us to the unresolved question, the crater at the center of this story that no computer sequencing has the power to fill. We know the when, and we know the who, but the why remains a ghost that haunts the Indian Ocean. There is absolutely no genetic evidence in the source notes, no study yet published, that finds a string of established intermediate settlements in the Maldives, the Chagos, or the Seychelles that show a Bornean population sitting there for a generation before moving on. The data points to a direct transoceanic shot, a journey of roughly 7,000 kilometers. It's a distance that equals the width of the Atlantic Ocean at its widest point. Prevailing theories lean on the monsoon wind patterns. For half the year, the wind blows southwest from the Indonesian archipelago toward Africa. For the other half, it blows northeast back. Did a trading ship simply miss the Maldives? Did political upheaval in the Srivijaya Empire of Sumatra push these Dayak Ma'anyan refugees out into the blue, carrying their rice seeds and their ancestors' bones, looking for a new world? We have to sit with the human cost of this. A direct crossing, even with favorable winds, would take weeks, if not months, in an open boat with no cabin, no compass, and only the food you brought with you. The hunger, the thirst, the salt sores, the terror of seeing nothing but an endless circular horizon, wondering if your navigator had lost the sky path. And yet they survived, not one boat, but plausibly a fleet, carrying enough men and women of reproductive age to successfully establish a dense, functioning population that resisted African cultural assimilation for 1,000 years. Why did they leave? Was it a lost war in the jungles of Borneo, a religious schism? Or was it simply the eruption of a specific kind of madness that has gripped humanity since we first carved a paddle? The desire to see if there is a shore at the edge of the map. The B4A1A1 mitochondrial marker your family might carry hummed with the energy of that reckless, terrifying hope. It is a strand of fate that connects the highlands of Madagascar not to the nearby continent you can see on a clear day, but to the misty, riverine cities of southern Kalimantan. Science has solved the composition of the genome, but the human heart of the question, the final, definitive reason why they set sail, lies beyond the reach of the sequencer, preserved only in the silence of the empty ocean. And there, buried in that silence, is where you, the viewer, enter the frame. Because this is not an abstraction. This is the story of your biological operating system. If you are of Malagasy descent, or if you've ever traced a DNA test back to that singular island, your body is a living monument to the most improbable blind date in human history. Think about what your immune system knows. The HLA genes, which fight off disease, are a mosaic curated on two opposite sides of the planet. Your ancestors on one branch weathered the fevers of Southeast Asian jungles. On the other, they survived the endemic parasites of the African savanna. When we talk about the Malagasy phenotype, a term that frustrates scientists because it refuses to sit still, we are looking at the riotous expression of this dual code. The straight, black hair common in Asia present on a face with the robust bone structure, sculpted by Bantu generations. The skin that can range from the deepest umber to a translucent ochre within a single family tree. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a real-time physics experiment in biology. And if you carry that specific paternal lineage, the O1A or O2A Y chromosome, you walk around with a time code inside you that predates the Mongol invasions, that predates the unification of Japan. It is a calling card from the forgotten era of the Austronesian century, a millennium when these canoe-born explorers discovered more of the blue planet than any other culture before the Europeans. But let's confront the darker texture of this heritage, the part that makes the ancestral narrative a complicated inheritance rather than a simple celebration. For all the romance of the outrigger canoe, the furious mixing that created the modern Malagasy genome was not a peaceful utopian melting pot. The statistics betray a power dynamic. Go back to the asymmetry, a heavy Bantu male influence, a strong Bantu female influence blending with the initial Austronesian settlers. This pattern speaks to a secondary wave that may have been violent, coercive, and deeply unequal. The slave trading networks that drew the Makua and Yao DNA into the genetic pool were brutal engines of human commodification. When a modern Malagasy person looks at a DNA test and sees the African component, they are seeing not just a migration, but a legacy of capture, of Swahili dhows cutting through the dawn with human cargo destined for labor on the plantations of the nascent Marina Kingdom or other coastal polities. The silent, low mitochondrial haplogroups whispered through the generations, carried by women whose names and stories are lost, staple marked into the historical record not as individuals but as a demographic flow. This isn't a sanitized collision of exotic cultures. It is a scar. It means that the 50-50 genetic split is not a harmonious yin and yang. It's a record of survival. A record where the Austronesian language and rice ritual proved resilient enough to frame the society, even as their original genetic purity was diluted into a new, blended human being. The ancestors didn't just mix. They wrestled, and that tension, the push and pull between the African coast and the Asian sea lane, is literally coded into the epigenetic markers that may be influencing your stress response today. The story takes yet another bewildering turn when we realize how recently this genetic collision reached its final form. Estimates from the Piron study and subsequent fine-tuning analyses continue to narrow the window of admixture timing. The initial Austronesian pulse likely predates the year 1000 CE, but the massive, homogenizing influx of Bantu DNA may not have peaked until as late as 1200 to 1400 CE, if not more recently in certain coastal regions. This is the blink of an eye in population genetics. Charlemagne was restoring the Holy Roman Empire while the final foundational chapters of the Malagasy genome were still being written. The gap between the first landfall and the final genetic equilibrium spans the very era when the great stone cities of Great Zimbabwe were trading gold for Chinese Celadon pottery. We found that pottery in the African interior. We know the networks existed. And within those networks, the Malagasy ships, now a hybridized culture with the seafaring memory of Borneo and the demographic muscle of Africa, likely circulated goods ranging from tortoiseshell to iron. The mystery isn't a dead civilization frozen in amber, it's a living, breathing continuity. Your grandparents, or great-grandparents, practicing the Famadihana turning of the bones ritual, unwrapping the shrouds of the dead, and dancing with the corpses to a melody carried from Asia, but singing in a rhythm pounded out by an African skin drum, were performing the latest iteration of that thousand-year-old entanglement. And as we place the final piece of this genetic puzzle onto the table, a conceptual gulf opens up beneath our feet. There is a reason the scientific community still speaks in hushed, speculative tones about this journey, even though the hard data has been locked in for years. The achievement contradicts our fundamental model of human diffusion. We are taught that pre-modern man hugged the coast, that we island-hopped through the visible stepping stones of Indonesia, that we feared the empty horizon. The Malagasy founding voyage shatters that cowardly model. It was not a coastal drift. It was a shot into the dark. The Maanyan speakers didn't stop in India. They didn't settle in the Maldives. We find no linguistic fossils, no genetic bottlenecks on those islands that would indicate a resting migration wave. This forces us to accept a terrifying proficiency in ancient navigation. These sailors understood the monsoon, a seasonal conveyor belt powered by the differential heating of the Asian continent and the Indian Ocean. A conveyor belt that in winter blows from the Malay archipelago to East Africa, and in summer blows right back. They must have known that if they missed Madagascar, a landmass the size of France, they would be swept into the roaring 40s of the Southern Ocean and die. There was no room for error. The voyage required a cognitive map of the entire basin, a concept known as winds and currents navigation that we usually only attribute to modern times. So, the final question isn't just why, it's how much have we lost? How many other incredible, death-defying voyages happened but ended in a watery grave, leaving no trace on any island? The Malagasy are not an anomaly of success. They might be the sole surviving testimony of a whole tradition of Indian Ocean crossing that we can no longer see. The evidence we have excavated from the source notes leaves us standing on the shores of Madagascar, weighed down by the intellectual certainty of DNA, yet still utterly mystified by the human spirit that carried it there. We know the atomic structure of the Ancestry. The admixture clock is mercilessly precise. A perfectly balanced cocktail of Bantu ironworkers and Bornean sailor kings, shaken and stirred roughly 800 to 1500 years ago. The Y chromosome O1A stands as a silent sentinel for the fathers from across the sea. The mitochondrial B4A1A1 hums the song of the mothers who cradled their children through the spray and the salt. The African E1B1A pulses with the rhythm of the mainland, with the machetes clearing the eastern bush and the drums of the village square. The linguistic software, from the numbers you count to the curses you spit, remains utterly, stubbornly Austronesian, a computer running on an Asian operating system, regardless of the African hardware that now envelops it. The unsolved riddle cools none of our burning curiosity. We remain confronted by the silence of the sea. The exact trigger in the Barito River Valley. Was it hunger, prophecy, war, or simply a cultural imperative for discovery? Is a ghost that refuses to be sequenced. The single data point we lack is the emotional truth of that departure. And perhaps that is the most powerful hook of all. Science can tell you exactly who you are, precisely when you got there, and which specific chromosome came from whom. It can tell you that your blood is a war treaty between two hemispheres that never met except within the crucible of your ancestors' bodies. But it cannot tell you the dream they chased. It cannot replay the exact argument in the clan meeting that voted to launch a fleet into the void. That mystery belongs to you. It is the shadow behind your reflection, the deep water in the mirror, and the reason why looking at your own fingerprint is like staring at a 4,000-mile-wide ocean. Now I want you to do something for me. Go look in the mirror again. Trace that curve of your smile, the arch of your cheekbones, the specific curl of your hair. What you are staring at is not just a face. It is the unresolved, unfinished, still breathing riddle of a 4,000-mile voyage that science has decoded but cannot fully explain. If you carry that Y chromosome O1A or the mitochondrial B4A1A1, you are walking proof that your ancestors didn't just survive the impossible. They chose it. So here's what I need you to do. If this story rewired the way you see your own reflection, smash that like button to tell the algorithm this is the kind of deep history mystery you want more of. Subscribe and ring the bell, because the next chapter of this story, the lost civilizations of the Indian Ocean that we haven't even found yet, is coming, and you do not want to miss it. And if you know someone of Malagasy heritage, someone who has no idea that their DNA is the smoking gun of the greatest migration mystery on Earth, share this video with them right now. Drop a comment below if you were on that outrigger canoe, staring at a 4,000-mile void. Would you have kept sailing, or would you have turned back? I want to know what you think, because the science is settled, but the human heart of this story is still up for debate. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.